the head of MI5 and other relevant officials. And I think that's hugely helpful. So both in two different ways. If you're talking about Syria as a foreign policy issue, you obviously want to have the Home Secretary there and our counter-terrorism experts to worry about the blowback from Syria of the radicalization and terrorism that's being fostered there. That's important. But also, if you're thinking about our relations with China and how we improve our relations with China, it's very good that you've got the Trade Minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Foreign Secretary, all the expertise from the Foreign Office, but you've also got the Home Secretary there to think about things like visas and border access and all of those things, which are an important part of our relationship. So I think we could shift to do some more domestic subjects, but I think the balance is pretty good, and when we're doing the foreign policy subjects, we take the domestic aspect very seriously.
At the outset, you did, understandably, as a new government, you did the National Security Strategy, the Spending Review and the Defence Review sort of alongside each other. Was the intention that the National Security Strategy set the context for the other reviews?
Yes, we did, as you say, as a new government, we had really to do all three things together: the security strategy, the strategic defence review, and of course, you know, a comprehensive spending review, and we did them all together. But the national security strategy helps set the context for what you want to do in terms of defence. I know that, having seen some of the work of your committee, people are very keen that the strategy is set and then the defence review is set out, and then and only then do you consider the resources issues. I think in the difficult and straitened times in which we live, I think that would be difficult. I think you do have to consider what is affordable alongside what is desirable. I think that's just realistic. But as you say, strategy should inform the defence decisions that we make.
I take the point that you're making, but you must know that it has been suggested that actually the Defence Review in particular was driven wholly by budgetary and not by strategic considerations.
No, I would reject that completely. The Defence Review was about how we should configure our defence forces given Britain's place in the world, given our foreign policy and security policy objectives. The most important decisions we took in that defence review were, you know, to radically reduce the number of battle tanks in Europe and to look at increasing the manoeuvrability, flexibility of our forces. We made some big decisions about investment in cyber security, spending more money. We made important decisions about bringing on stream 2 new aircraft carriers. So, you know, this was not driven by spending. Of course, it was informed by what we believed was affordable, but it was a proper strategic defence review that took proper strategic decisions.
There's one other issue that I particularly wanted to raise with you at the outset, because we referred to it in our first report. In the National Security Strategy itself, against the background of describing the rise of new global powers, shifts in the centres of economic activity, the strategy still said there should be no reduction in influence for the UK. And in your most recent report that's just come out on the National Security Strategy, you talk about enhancing the influence, no, expanding the influence of the UK. We were concerned at the outset that no reduction in influence was unrealistic. When you say expanding now, do you mean spreading it ever thinner across the world?
No, I don't. I mean, I'd answer the question in two ways. I mean, first of all, if you look across our projection of power and influence, so that is the Foreign Office, international development, defence, trade, I think you can definitely see that Britain is actually doing more. We've been opening embassies. We've been expanding our presence in India and China. I think we're one of the only European countries with a full embassy in every ASEAN nation. So there's no doubt in my mind that part of our strategy is that we want to link up with the fastest growing parts of the world. We want to be an open and engaged power. So we're using all of what we have to do that. But I would argue, even in the area of defence, where of course the defence budget has come down in real terms, not by a huge amount, but by a small amount, even in the defence of defence, because we've made choices, fewer battle tanks in Europe, but actually investment in things like drones and cyber and flexibility, I would argue that there's been no reduction in, no long-term reduction in Britain's defence capabilities and our ability to, stand up for ourselves in important ways around the world. So I don't really. I also sort of reject the idea that you can only measure how engaged you are and how successful you are in projecting influence by how much money you spend. No business goes about its life like that. We've got to make sure we get as much into the teeth and as little into the tail of our defence, and I would argue that the MOD under Philip Hammond's leadership has been pretty successful at that. So I don't really accept the idea that because we're spending a little bit less on defence, we can't be as significant a defence player.
In a moment I'm going to hand over to Lord Walgrave, but Mr Arbuthnot wants to come in briefly.
Isn't it embarrassing that we're spending more on the winter fuel allowance than we are on the Foreign Office?
Well, we're spending the right amount on the Foreign Office to see an expanding global network. I'm as it were, great user of our Foreign Office. I travel all over the world, flying the flag for British business, trying to encourage investment, encourage exports. And I see in our Foreign Office an amazing asset. I think we've got some brilliant diplomats. We've got some fantastic teams around the world. The Foreign Office was relatively well treated by the Comprehensive Spending Review. And I don't see a Foreign Office in retreat at all. I see a Foreign Office in advance, opening new posts. As I say, I think we've now got a bigger presence in India than any other European power, expanding in China, opening in a whole series of new nations. What we spend on the winter fuel allowance is necessary to help keep people warm.
Lord Walgrave.
Prime Minister, we're going to be talking a lot about security and strategy today, and it might be just worth seeing that we're using words in the same way, roughly. When you talk about strategy, what do you mean by strategy?
To me, strategy is about setting out a very clear series of goals that you want to meet, and then making sure you've got sensible means for achieving those goals. So, I don't have to look at a bit of paper to tell you what our strategy is. It is to restore Britain's economic strength. It's to tie us to the fast-growing parts of the world. It's to refresh and enhance the great alliances that we've got. It's to tackle the threats that could threaten our country, and it's to make sure we do this right across government, not just the Foreign Office fighting for us abroad, but every single bit of government working together. That's the strategy. And maybe I'm too much of a sort of practical chap. I think having sort of set the strategy, really what you want to try and use government for is to make sure you're implementing the strategy. I think the NSC, yes, of course we discuss strategy, but I want us to determine policy, I want us to agree action, and then I want us to check up that we've done what we said we were going to do. And so to me, that is not misusing the NSC, making it too much about implementation rather than strategy. It's the right use, because I don't know what you found when you were in government, but I find the problem is all too often that people love sitting around talking about strategy, but it's getting people to do things and act and to complete on the strategy that is often the challenge.
Thank you. Next word, security. A little bit in that answer there. You took security very widely, and there's no final answer to this, but you could include practically everything in security, from having a healthy democracy to having good social cohesion to energy policy to agricultural policy. Everything can be strategy if we're not careful. But if it's going to work, it's got to sort of be some things and not some other things. Yeah. So how do you use security here?
Well, security is, it is all of it. You have to take a wide definition, because our nation's security relies on having strong defences so that we can protect ourselves, but it also means considering every risk to our security, from floods, pandemic diseases, new threats like volcanic eruptions or space weather or whatever. You've got to consider all of these things. And what we tried to do with the National Security Secretariat is bring together in one place in the Cabinet Office under Kim's leadership the teams that do all of these things. So security in the end is the ability to protect your country, your people and your interests so they can grow and prosper. And in delivering security, you've got to deal with every threat, from the biggest to the most unlikely. And the point of having this big army in Whitehall is to make sure we're covering all of those threats, some of which I'm sure we'll talk about today.
So security, pretty wide definition. I mean, for example, let me just give you an example. Is tax avoidance by multinational companies, is that part of national security? Some people might say it was, other people might say it wasn't.
Well, if we couldn't, look, at the heart of our national security strategy is restoring Britain's economic strength. I mean, as I think we're seeing at the moment, if you gain in economic strength, many of the other things you're trying to do fall into place. If you lose economic strength, you're in a much more difficult situation. And so if we say that at the heart of our national security is strengthening our economy, then if we can't properly raise taxes from businesses because technology has changed and they're not playing by the rules, that would be, I suppose, a threat to your security.
I mean, you'll see, I'm trying to probe what isn't.
I can see.
Could you?
I think what you have to do, isn't it, is to have a hierarchy, which is what, I'm afraid we've got a terrible list of acronyms in the National Risk Assessment and the National Resilience Planning assumptions, but the attempt is to try and delineate risks to security, have them all dealt with in one part of Whitehall, and make sure we've got a strategy for dealing with all of them.
Yeah. Could you give me an example? I know that events nearby events and all that, but could you give me an example of where people were thinking, we ought to do X, but that clashes with the strategy. So although it seems a good idea at the moment, actually we shouldn't do that because it clashes with the strategy.
I think a good example was probably it's more about balancing interests. I mean, these issues about visa discussions. When we decide about visa rules and visa waivers for countries, you've got to weigh up the prosperity agenda with the security agenda and make sure that you're making the right decision. Now, I think in the past, visa decisions were made by the Home Office, prosperity decisions were made about the Treasury, and never the twain shall meet. We now discuss and debate them round the table about, we've got very important economic relations with this country. Frankly, the visa restrictions are getting in the way. Is the national security really being threatened? And then we have a good barney about it, and we reach a decision. In terms of things that have been proposed that fall absolutely counter to the strategy, I'm struggling to think of one, but I think that visa example is not a bad one of where you've got a policy issue, which countries get visa preference, and you've got a way of properly discussing it in terms of your security and strategy.
Thank you.
Mr. Murphy.
Thank you, Chair. Prime Minister, we'd like to know a little bit more about how the NSC actually works, how it operates. And at the moment, the committee has some idea of the agendas that you have based on names of countries. So one week you'll be dealing with Syria, another Afghanistan, another week with Northern Ireland. It doesn't indicate to us, without giving any secrets away, how operational or long-term or strategic those discussions might be. Now, my experience of cabinet committees is that the Secretary of State comes in, gives a report to the committee, we have a talk about it, and it's the end of the committee. Is it more than that?
It is a lot more than that, because what this National Security Council does, it brings together not only the ministers, foreign, and it's normally the Secretary of State. We don't really allow, if we can avoid it, junior ministers coming in their place. I think it's very important that my cabinet ministers see this as one of the most important meetings of the whole week. But it brings together Foreign Secretary, Chancellor, Prime Minister, DFID Secretary, with the heads of the intelligence agencies, with the head of the JIC, with the Chief of the Defence Staff, if necessary, the head of the Metropolitan Police or someone to do with counter-terrorism. And you've got the experts in the room as well as the politicians. The format of the meetings is often a presentation rather than just a massive paperwork, and the presentation will often be given by Sir Kim or a leading Foreign Office official to set out in front of the committee the choices that we have to make. And sometimes it's very operational. We might have on Afghanistan, for instance, we'll want to have a proper look at the drawdown plans the Ministry of Defence have, and as a committee we'll want to work out, is that the right operational plan for Britain. I think that is very operational, but I think right. I think it's right that the government collectively decides these things. Sometimes it can be very strategic. We might have a discussion about our relations with the emerging powers, and it'll be about how we best go about, who should we be seeking relationships with, and how do we improve them. Sometimes it can be a meeting where it really helps to have a collective discussion and a decision. So, for instance, we have this thing, the conflict pool, bringing together money from defence, foreign affairs and DFID, and I think it's good that we sit round the table and say, right, we got this money, how are we going to spend it? Which conflict areas and unstable states should our investment be going into? We're about to have a conversation about the DFID budget, because obviously it's important the DFID budget is determined according to aid principles, but I think it's important to discuss this collectively so we can see the links between what we're doing in terms of, fragile states that we're trying to help fix with aid decisions that we're making. So it's a long answer, but I think what I'm trying to say is sometimes very operational, sometimes very strategic, but sometimes genuinely making operational decisions that have an impact across Whitehall.
That's very useful. In terms of perhaps the longer term or more strategic meetings that you could have, one thing we've noticed that the meetings seem to inevitably, I suppose, dry up in July, and then they start again sometime in October. Would there be a case, do you think, of having one or two meetings extra in that period to look more widely at things, more discursively, if you like? And at the same time, the committee's been considered whether, in fact, the NSC has sufficient outside expertise to come in and give advice and knowledge to help you out. And finally, do you think that just 2 staff belonging to the NSC is really enough?
Sorry, how many staff?
2.
Oh no, the NSC is serviced by the National Security Secretariat, which is, Kim, how many 200 people? 200 people. So, I mean, you really feel that the NSC, it's not a committee that just sort of brings together Whitehall. It's got a proper team behind it that can then operationalise decisions and make them happen. In terms of outside advice, we have, I think, on occasion brought outsiders in, but we've also occasionally had seminars that NSC members would attend in order to hear from outside experts. We had a particularly good session on Pakistan and Afghanistan when some experts came. We had a special NSC in August last year on Syria. For my G8 agenda of tax and transparency and all of that, we had a whole series of experts in to address those issues, people like Paul Collier. In terms of meeting over the summer, we have had meetings over the summer. I think if the criticism is that urgent operational meetings to discuss Syria, Afghanistan, Libya tend to crowd out more thematic discussions, I think I'd probably plead guilty. I think that is inevitable when governments have to prioritise and choose and talk about the most urgent things. That I would, I think, say that we have spent more time on the operational emergencies than rather blue sky thinking.
Thank you very much indeed.
We're tight for time, although we're doing reasonably well. Mr. Pritchard wants to come in briefly, Mark?
Yes, Chair, thank you. Prime Minister, I support the innovation of the National Security Council. I think anything that allows sharing of institutional knowledge and corporate knowledge within government is a good thing. But prior to the NSC, if there was a strategic decision, let's say relating to defence or foreign affairs, it was usually the practice the Foreign Secretary or the Defence Secretary would make the final decision. Now we have the NSC, and if you're chairing that meeting, if there was, can you think of an occasion where there has been a foreign policy or a defence decision where you have taken the ultimate decision rather than the Secretary of State?
It's good. I'm not sure Mrs. Thatcher or Tony Blair would say that necessarily they just left defence and foreign policy decisions to their Secretaries of State and only occasionally intervened. I think the history, although I'm not the constitutional historian, I think the history is more that it's often ended as a bilateral thing between a Prime Minister and a Foreign Secretary, or a Prime Minister and a Defence Secretary. I think the good thing about this innovation is that it is a more collective way of making decisions. Now, of course, there are still important decisions made by individual ministers, come through number 10 in the normal way. But, you know, if you look at the SDSR decisions, if you look at the decisions over, for instance, how we went about our engagement in Libya and the decisions we made about Syria, they were genuinely discussed around the table with those ministers, with the expert advice, and another point, I think, a better institutionalisation of the legal advice, because, of course, the Attorney General sits around the table and is there to give his opinion on these things. If you're asking, are there times when the NSC has come to a different decision to perhaps what the Foreign Secretary or Defence Secretary or even Prime Minister thought when they first walked into the room? Yes, it has, and that's what collective decision-making is about.
Mr. Arbuthnot.
I think this is very helpful. We'd like to ask a series of questions on how the system actually works in practice, and you've mentioned Syria. How did this is in a sense a repeat of the question that Lord Waldegrave asked, but how did the national security strategy affect the way you made decisions and the decisions you took on Syria?
Well, obviously, when we drew up the strategy and the SDSR in 2010, we didn't have perfect foresight about what was going to happen in the events of the Arab Spring and in Syria. I'd like to think that the decisions we've made in all these have been relatively consistent with the strategies set out in the National Security Strategy. But I don't, a strategy always has to be adaptable and has to be changeable according to circumstances. I think it was Mike Tyson who said everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth. You have to make sure that you can adapt what you have. But I would say that the strategy is about Britain engaging in the world in order to protect its interests, but also to promote British values like democracy and freedom of speech and human rights. I would argue that what we did in Libya and the approach that we've been taking in Syria is consistent with that.
What would you say your strategic goal was in Syria?
I think twofold. First of all, we've taken a general view as a National Security Council that while there are risks in the instability that the Arab Spring has thrown up, we've taken a general view that the advance of what I would call the building blocks of democracy, more open societies, more participatory systems, is a good thing in the long term for security. There will always be bumps on the road, but that is a good thing, and so we should basically be encouraging those sorts of developments.
But what if Parliament had authorised the use of force in August?
Well, of course, the use of force that was being asked for was linked purely and simply to the issue of chemical weapons. I think the debate, in a way, we had in Parliament ended up being a debate, quite a lot of it, about what happened in Iraq and what some people feared might happen in Syria. It wasn't really a debate so much about the use of chemical weapons and our response to that. Fortuitously, because I think there was a tough global response, Syria has decided to give up its chemical weapons, and progress on that is not too bad. But when it comes to approaching Syria, our arguments have been Britain continues with its very strong position on humanitarian aid, which is set out in the National Security Strategy. We continue with our support for developments that are positive under the heading of the Arab Spring, which I think is consistent with the values in here. But we're also taking a very, very strong and careful look at how we protect ourselves from the risks of terrorism and extremism, which I think is a growing threat in Syria. I think we need to now spend a huge amount of time on working out how we best mitigate that.
But coming back to this issue of chemical weapons for a moment, presumably you had a strategic goal in mind. What was it? Was it to make Assad give up the chemical weapons, or was it regime change, or was
the strategic goal was not
a message of punishment, or what?
The strategic goal that I discussed with President Obama before the vote in the House of Commons was that, having set a red line on chemical weapons use, we couldn't allow Assad to cross it with impunity. And the sort of military action that was envisaged was purely and simply about chemical weapons. And I judged, that it was important not only in the context of Syria, but also the argument I made in the House of Commons was that the prohibition on the use of chemical weapons has been of immense value to Britain and countries like Britain, for decades. And so it was worthwhile taking a strong stance on this issue, not just because of Syria, but because of the message it would send to other dictators around the world if we didn't take that stand. As I say, happily, without military action being taken, the desired effect has been achieved, which is that they do look as if they're making real progress with giving up their chemical weapons. That's what it was about. It was not about regime change. It was not about broadening the conflict. It was purely and simply about that issue.
I know Lord Harris has further questions on Syria.
Yeah, my specific question is, I think we're all concerned about the implications of people who fought in Syria returning to this country, having honed their skills in combat, acquired new techniques and so on. Is that the sort of issue that is discussed by the National Security Council?
Yes, in quite a lot of detail. I mean, all the way through our discussions about Syria. And I think Syria has been a really difficult challenge for policymakers all over the Western world because nobody wants to get involved in conflicts, but on the other hand, everyone could see right from the start that this was a conflict which was going to drive extremism and instability and cause huge problems in the region. So it's been a massive challenge, but every discussion we've had about Syria, we've also discussed the dangers of British people travelling to Syria, the dangers of extremism, the dangers of terrorism, terrorists returning home. I think the signs in Syria are extremely worrying on that front at the moment. Not unrelated is why we're downstairs in the House of Commons debating how we should be able to take away people's citizenship. So we've got a cross-government response which has got to be securing our own borders, discouraging people from travelling to Syria, working with allies to deal with the terrorist threat, stopping people coming back, etc., etc. I mean, it's a very, very big focus for us right now.
So what was, as the Home Secretary's announcement yesterday, was that a decision of the National Security Council?
That was something that we have looked at in the Security Council. I don't recall whether the decision was actually taken for that specific measure, but she has been empowered by the National Security Council to look at these issues.
Okay, that's very helpful. And you told us earlier about this isn't just about foreign policy and here's a domestic element to that. But there are obviously other issues where people might say, hang on, defending the country against terrorism, we put 600 odd million a year into policing counter-terrorism. There's another £2 billion or so spent on the single intelligence account. Yet we have people at the moment having problems with floods, and our expenditure on flood defence was, I think, last year 560 million, rising next year. Does the National Security Council get involved in deciding how to allocate resources between the different risks on the National Risk Register? And if so, how do you reach a conclusion?
It's a very good question. I mean, what we have is a national risk assessment as well as a National Risk Register, which is a document that we use to try and assess these risks. We discuss that and agree it and try to make sure we're dealing with risks in an appropriate way. It's very difficult to try and measure up the amount you spend on one subject with the amount you spend on another and the respective threats. I can't pretend there's an exact science in it, but I would say that because all these risks and risk registers are brought together in the National Security Secretariat, that at least we've got one part of government that's trying to measure all this up and a committee that then looks at it.
So do you look at those resource choices?
Yes, we do look at resource choices, yes. I mean, specifically in terms of the intelligence budget is quite a good example of the National Security Council in action. The budget comes in front of the NSC and it's a good moment where the politicians can act as inquisitors to the experts about have we got the balance right between counter-terrorism and counter-espionage? Have we got the balance right between counter-terrorism policing and broader intelligence spending? But the question you're asking, do you measure up absolutely directly kind of floods on the one hand to the chance of terrorism on the other? Well, they're all in the National Risk Register, but it's quite difficult to argue there's a science where you can try and work out whether you've got the exact amount of money in the exact place.
Just a finger in the air and you say 600 million there.
You're bringing it together, you're looking at your potential weaknesses, and you're trying to make sure that you are correctly identifying the gaps.
And has the National Security Council discussed flooding?
We have a subcommittee of the national. We've discussed flooding in the context of the National Risk Register, National Risk Assessment, and we have a specific subcommittee that looks at resilience and threats and hazards. But flooding has more generally been dealt with through COBRA. I think it's a mistake to think that the NSC is entirely strategic and COBRA is entirely operational. You know, I do use COBRA to address issues where you need a cast slightly wider than the National Security Council, and flooding is a good example of that.
And do you have, either as part of that process or as part of the National Security Council, a long-term plan for the impact of climate change on the UK? For example, have you considered which pieces of the critical national infrastructure are most threatened by rising sea levels?
Yes, we have. I mean, we both had discussions in the National Security Council about climate change. We need to have another one probably before the next Concert of Parties meeting. But we also have a piece of work that's been done on critical infrastructure and the potential threats to critical infrastructure, including from floods and from rising sea levels, and that has been considered. I want to make sure I'm not misleading the committee in any way, but I mean that's right. The critical infrastructure work is something that's coordinated by the NSS, yes, and then gets put up to ministers.
Okay, thank you.
Prime Minister, coming back to something you mentioned before about the reorganisation of the Ministry of Defence, this committee's report last year mentioned the fact that the future Army 2020, for example, the entire redrawing of the structure of the reserves, had not been something that had come before the National Security Council. Do you think we were right to be concerned about that? And why was that?
Well, I never want to criticise Sir Kim on my left, who does a fantastic job, but I looked over his evidence and I wanted to check. And I think it's actually true to say that the National Security Council did discuss the army structure before the announcement was made. So I don't want to give the impression that this was a process entirely outside
to
the
be
national...
fair to Sir Kim, I think it was the Secretary of State for Defence who told us that.
Right. Okay. Well, I will. I'll blame him instead. But anyway, the point. I think where you've got a fair point, which is we announced the SDSR. That was very much done by the NSC. A piece that was sorted out later was the overall structure of the army. But I think I'm right in saying that the reserves work was commissioned by the NSC, and then the result of that and the future structure of reserves versus regulars, that was discussed by the NSC before announcement. Have I got that right?
Oh, well, that is good to know.
But I mean, I think if you're saying, look, you should have done the whole thing in one go at the SDSR, you know, obviously that would have been neater, but sometimes, you know, these things take a few iterations to get absolutely right.
Neater, but probably impossible.
Probably.
Yes. I know Lady Taylor.
Thank you. Prime Minister, still on security, but changing the emphasis slightly, or somewhat. Risk and public perception. Mention's just been made of flooding, and if you ask lots of people what's the biggest risk, they would say flooding. When we've had terrorist incidents, yeah, that's what it has been. I'm wondering to what extent your strategy, which you outlined all those headings of economic benefit, which we'd all agree with, you know, who is actually responsible for engaging the public so that their perception of risk is not just a knee-jerk reaction to the latest problem, and that when somebody challenges what the government is doing, you're actually able to explain. We were talking about Syria a moment ago. You said the debate even in the House was mainly focused on Iraq. So how do you deal with that? Who in government is responsible for getting that kind of message about proper perceptions of risk?
I hope that by having a National Security Council, people can see that these risks are being looked at as a whole and in the round, and in the end it falls to the Prime Minister to try and explain how we look at risks and the steps that we take and what we try and do to keep the country safe. I think our scientists can probably help by informing the debate about risks and probabilities. I mean, I think also your committee is helping, because you're looking at our strategy and you're saying, well, have you done enough consideration of this, and have you looked at those risks? So it's not a great answer, but I think in the end, have a strategy, explain what it is. The Prime Minister has to front it up. The scientists can help by explaining some of the the probabilities and risks, and that's probably the best you can do. Coming back to this flooding versus terrorism, I think people want to know we're doing everything possible to protect dwellings from flooding and that we've got a forward investment program and all the rest of it. But I think people understand that there are severe weather events that can affect your country. You do everything you can to mitigate, but in the end you can't mitigate against every single thing. Whereas, these appalling terrorist events, which can be so indiscriminate and are such huge risks, they just want to know you're doing everything possible to prevent them from happening in the first place.
Do you think that the recent problems that we have all seen about the Snowden revelations and the way in which they have been publicised, lauded by some people, are actually undermining public confidence in our security agencies? And if so, who's responsible for defending the agencies and explaining and giving some perspective to some of these difficult discussions?
I think, first of all, in response to Snowden, I think what we have to do is make sure we're confident that the governance procedures for the intelligence services are robust. The Intelligence and Security Committee, intelligence commissioners, things happen under the law, the role of ministers. And I keep asking myself, well, we've got a good system in place, and I think we have. I don't rule out trying to improve it. In terms of has it dented public confidence in the work of the security services, I don't know the answer to that question. I haven't seen the opinion polling, but my sense is that the public reaction, as opposed to some of the media reaction, is, look, we have intelligence and security services because it's a dangerous world and there are bad people who want to do terrible things to us, and we should support these intelligence services and the work they do. And I think the public reaction, what I've felt in terms of what people's reaction has been pretty robust. Who's responsible for defending the security services and explaining what they do? I think I have a responsibility. I feel I am the minister for the intelligence services, and I have a responsibility to stand up for them, thank them publicly, because they can't be thanked publicly as other emergency services are, and to try and explain what they do, and I've done some of that. I think they are often the best spokespeople for themselves. I think their appearance in front of the Parliamentary Committee recently was excellent. I think the speech that the head of the security service made was very, very good summary of the threats we face. So I don't want them to, they've got to focus on the day job, but I don't want them to make a speech every week. But I think it's actually, they can help set the agenda and explain what they do perhaps better than anyone. Final
question, but I mean, don't you think that there is potential danger that lack of public support for what a government might feel is essential to do in certain circumstances might be undermined unless there is a more robust defence of what could be needed and a better explanation? And shouldn't that be part of your planning when you're actually talking about your strategy? The strategy should not just be about the economic benefits, but actually about explaining it in a wider base.
I think it's a very fair point. I think if you're saying, should the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, who's responsible for two of the intelligence agencies, and the Home Secretary, who's responsible for another one, should the three of us do more to explain, defend, and give people a sense of why their work is so important? Yes, I agree with that. I think we should do more. If we're worried about damage, I mean, I'm worried about the damage that Snowden has done to our security. I'm very worried about what it's done, and I would encourage the newspapers that are endlessly dallying in this to think before they act, because we are in danger of making ourselves, severe danger, making ourselves less safe as a result. And as I say, but I think the public reaction, as I judge it, has not been one of sort of shock horror. It's been much more, well, intelligence agencies carry out intelligence work. Good.
Thank you. With hindsight, Prime Minister, is there anything you think the NSC has missed?
I think there are some specific subjects of quite a technical nature that organisations like yours and others have drawn to our attention. I mean, I'm not a scientist, and so EMPs and space weather and some of these I think that's been useful actually to give the politicians to challenge the officials in the machine about have we got this covered and have we got that covered. I think we need to go faster with this work about really examining Whitehall's plans, whether it's the DFID budget, whether it's the conflict pool. Can we do more to make this organisation really drive policy rather than just strategy? I think we should probably do more on that. In terms of missing things, look, I think there are lots of things that the pundits and the politicians and the experts have not foreseen in the development of global affairs, but that's why, yes, have a strategy, but recognise you need to adapt it to changing circumstances.
One thing that we commented early on that we'd missed in the original national security strategy, because we're about to go on to the next one, was this question of the Americans announcing their pivot to Asia, which has enormous strategic consequences. That wasn't touched on at all in the security strategy.
I think I'm right in saying, when was the pivot speech, the great Obama speech? Was it 2010 or 11? 2010 or 11? I mean, the first thing I'd say is that we are doing our own pivot. If you look at the amount of Foreign Office activity in Southeast Asia, the ASEAN countries I mentioned, what we're doing in China and India, I think there's a real evidence that William is changing that department and focusing it on the high growth, emerging powers, and all the rest of it. I also think we haven't mentioned our Gulf strategy, which I think is actually quite a big breakthrough too, to recognise there's a whole set of countries with whom we have enormous amounts of history, very strong relations, very strong defence relations, where we should really try and build on those relationships. So I think we're doing our own pivoting. I think if I had a wish of replaying it all, I think the things the SDSR did in terms of moving us away from the battle tanks in Western Europe and towards flexible, deployable, future technologies, cyber, drones and the rest of it, I wish we'd done more and faster. And I suppose I'd apply that to the foreign policy side as well. I think this prosperity, trade diplomacy agenda, which now is being driven very hard across government, I would have liked to have done even more, even sooner, because I think it's going to be part of our future national success. If we can massively increase exports to China and investment from China, if we can link up with the fastest growing countries, that is going to be a big part of Britain's future success story. So we need to, you remember from being Foreign Secretary, getting the tanker of Whitehall to move, you always afterwards think, I wish I'd pushed it harder and faster.
Thank you. We're going to move on now to the area of preparation for the next national security strategy. Sir Malcolm.
Thank you very much, Chair. Well, when Sir Peter Ricketts was in the role, he told us that it would take 2 years to prepare a new strategy. Since then, there's been a staff cut of 25%. The work on the next strategy hasn't started, so was he wrong? Can you tell us when it will start, how long it will take, and when it will be ready? Well,
the work is now beginning on both national security strategy and more particularly on SDSR, because the next SDSR we need to start planning now. Look, you can argue forever about how long these things take, but I'm so keen on implementing what we've said we're going to do that I put more weight on that. As I say, my fear is that if you move faster on writing new strategies, all the people that are trying to deliver what we need in Libya or in Syria, or they'll come off that and they'll start writing strategies again.
But will it be fundamentally different, or will it follow the same one? And am I right in assuming it won't be finished until the next government is in place?
Which one, with the NSS and the SDSR, both?
Well, the NSS certainly.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think they will. They're going to span the period of the next election. We should be starting now. I don't think, if you go back over the national security strategy, it needs a refresh. I don't think it's going to be a complete overhaul. I think, as I've hinted to Margaret, that if I'm responsible for its eventual outcome, I think it will have that trade prosperity agenda perhaps even more strongly at its heart. But I wouldn't expect a a huge change in either the national security strategy or indeed the SDSR. The decision we took in the SDSR, for instance, the very difficult decision about having a gap in carrier capacity, the exciting thing is, as we come into the next SDSR, that gap's going to be coming to an end, and we're going to have a fantastic new aircraft carrier sailing out into the high seas pretty soon.
With planes.
With planes on it. And people in it.
Can we look at, between the three of us in this panel, some of the specific future things? In particular, we've talked about the pivot for America, but what about the European Union, which we will not know in the next strategy whether the UK will be a member of the European Union or not, and yet it's absolutely central to most of our strategic decisions. So will that be spelt out, the implications being in or out, and indeed specifically how it will change if the UK ceased to be a member of the European Union?
Well, my strategy, which is linked in with the national security strategy, is that we secure for Britain a reform in the European Union, and we secure a referendum, and I want to recommend that we should remain part of a reformed European Union, and I plan on the basis of success rather than the basis of anything else. But it goes to a broader point. Actually, we don't, European issues we haven't dealt with in the National Security Council. We've dealt with them elsewhere in government. I accept this has important implications for the UK, but as I say, I think we should plan on the basis of what we want to achieve.
Well, yes, but it's a democratic vote, and if people are going to vote the other way in spite of your recommendation, it has strategic implications. I mean, we have a vote this year on Scottish independence, and the government have produced a series of papers setting out their case. Basically, the case as to why the UK is better together. Will you not do the same thing for the European Union?
Well, we have done with the balance of competences review, looked at the various areas, but I think once the negotiation is complete, there will then be a period before an in-out referendum where the two sides in that debate can set out their arguments. And as you know, we're in a coalition government. The coalition partners have slightly different views about Europe. My judgment is that if we'd used the NSC to debate and discuss Europe issues, we would have had quite a lot of second reading debates in the NSC, as it were, rather than what I want is agreeing a strategy and the actions necessary to deliver it. So I think it's been better to keep Europe out of the NSC.
All right, well, another specific issue, and I'll be a bit quick about this one, but we heard in the past that our food security, and essentially we're about 3 days away from a food crisis at any one time, because most of our food is in transit, and we found that out with the truck driver strike. Yeah. Do you believe that you have addressed enough about how some disruption of our communications could lead to a food crisis and how it will be responded? And is that something that is central to the security strategy? Because clearly food shortages could move the country to very severe crisis in a very short space of time.
Well, what we've done is we've had a review of government plans for handling threats to resilience of food supplies carried out by Oliver Letwin, who did a 2013 review of emergency planning. It concluded there was relatively good resilience in the UK food supply chain, and we also carried out a UK food security assessment in 2010. So it's part of the critical national infrastructure plan that we have. You're definitely right that, as a country that imports food, that has a lot of just-in-time delivery and all the rest of it, dislocation, whether volcanic ash from Iceland or a truck driver strike or what have you, does impact those things relatively quickly. But I mean, I'm satisfied that we have examined the issues, but that's not to say that you don't get effects when infrastructure is threatened.
Okay.
Prime Minister, in the annual report on the NSS and the SDSR published last December, there was a paragraph which started with the sentence, "It has been a government priority to introduce a programme to preserve the ability of the security, intelligence and law enforcement agencies to have the access they require in communications data." And the paragraph goes on and ends with, "Changes to the existing legislative framework may be required to maintain these vital capabilities." And I understand that the Interception Commissioner, Sir Anthony May, is reviewing the fitness of our legislation, and no doubt will report to you. But I wondered that in view of the maelstrom that's hit us all from Edward Snowden's leaked material, if there was anything you could share with us today to comment about the position of the United Kingdom in the light of what was said in this report?
Well, first of all, I'd agree with the report that over time we are going to have to modernise the legislative framework and practice when it comes to dealing with communications data. It's obviously a politically quite contentious topic. I'm not sure that we'll make progress on it in the coming months in terms of legislation. There may be some things short of legislation we can do, but I do think that politicians, police chiefs, the intelligence services, we've got a role in explaining what this is all about, because I think that, while I wouldn't go back on what I said earlier, that I don't think Snowden's had an enormous public impact. I think it inevitably raises questions about, well, who has access to my data and why. But I'm absolutely convinced that proper rules for communications data is essential. And I don't think we got across to people yet the absolute basics of this, which is, you know, in most of the serious crimes and sort of child abductions, comms data, who called who and when, and where was the telephone at the time, not the content of the call, the communications data is absolutely vital. And I think we need the police chiefs, the investigators and others, and the politicians explaining what this is about. I mean, I love watching, as I probably should stop telling people, you know, crime dramas on the television. There's hardly a crime drama where a crime is solved without using the data of a mobile communications device. And that's not about the content, it's about... And the problem we've got to explain to people is that as you move from a world of people having fixed telephones and mobile phones to Skype and phones on the internet and all of that, if we don't modernise the practice and modernise the law, over time we will have the communications data to solve these horrible crimes on a shrinking proportion of the total use of devices. And that is a real problem for keeping people safe. Now, I don't know whether that was the clearest explanation I could give, but we've got to make this explanation very, very clear, and we've got to really get it out to people, and then build, perhaps at the start of the next Parliament, a cross-party case for sensible legislation to deal with this issue. I think it is possible, but I think it's going to take a lot of work by politicians across parties to try and take the civil liberties concerns seriously, but get them in proportion so we can then make some progress.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I think we'd all agree with that. And I think it follows on very well from what Lady Taylor raised. But perhaps it is something the NSC could look at, is how to get what you've said over to the general public, the difference between data and content and so on. And
well, the best attempt I've seen so far was actually, I think one or two police chiefs wrote some articles for newspapers, and I thought when they explained just how much this involved in child abduction cases, in solving murders and solving serious crimes, I absolutely see in my work with security services and how vital it is to prevent terrorist attacks. I mean, I feel passionately about this because I feel the first responsibility in my job is to help keep people safe. But I think the fact it's used in so much crime, I think is a very straightforward and understandable thing that people can get hold of.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask you about something else. Prime Minister, we all understand the desirability of foreign investment for the good of our economy and so on. But has the NSC looked closely enough at the issue of foreign ownership of parts of our critical infrastructure? I'm thinking of energy, nuclear power and waste, water and so on. And are you confident that there isn't reason to be concerned about whether or not there should be some clearer red lines drawn about foreign ownership?
Well, we do have a proper system in place for examining whether inward investments into things like infrastructure are in our national interest. But actually, Sir Kim and I were discussing this earlier, there is going to be a proper NSC consideration of this because we have slightly different procedures for some slightly different parts of our infrastructure. And I think it'd be good to have a proper collective discussion about, are we happy when it comes to telecoms and electricity networks and gas networks and what have you, that we've got all the rules that we need in place. So we will do that. I would, and when we've had a specific issue, like the Huawei issue, we've properly examined and responded to the ISC report. I wouldn't underplay, though, the fact that I think Britain saying to the world that we welcome inward investment, and we welcome inward investment into key parts of infrastructure. The fact that Chinese are going to be invested into Hinkley Point Power Station, I think is a good thing. It means that we can free up more of our own capital to spend on roads and railways and other things. And it also makes an enormous, it's a very good message for Britain going around the world that, we're not embarrassed that Tata own Jaguar Land Rover. We're delighted that Indian capital is rebuilding the British car industry combined with British craftsmanship, and we're beating the world. We're delighted the Chinese are going to own part of Thames Water, investing in Heathrow. I think it is one of our calling cards that we are an open economy that encourages people to invest. So yes, by all means, let's check that if there were security issues, we could act properly and appropriately, and we will do, but don't let's lose the position as a great open economy. I was very struck by what Wanda, one of the large Chinese investors, said last week, that America is more open than Europe, but Britain is best of all, and I thought that was a good endorsement.
Thank you.
Prime Minister, I was very glad when you were saying that you wished you could even spend more time and effort on Asia. It's worth remembering that with the Commonwealth, and some of us who've been involved in Asia for well over 200 to 300 years, with a history of trade in this country, that we've already been there before the Americans even turned up. So I just thought it was, and on the background of that, I just wanted to get your views, because Mr. Gates made a comment the other day, who's the former Defense Secretary of America, and which caused quite a lot of comment. Could I put this to you, that to ensure global reach in support of our long-term and historic trade and security interests, and particularly important, together with fulfilling our part of a crucial relationship with the United States Navy, we must guarantee that the Royal Navy has high-end capability with the necessary number and mix of ships. You stated, Prime Minister, on the 31st of January 2013, that, your words, your strong view was that the defence budget will require year-on-year real-term growth in the years beyond 2015. And as a leading member of NATO, we're totally committed to no less than 2% of our GDP for our defence budget. I hope you're able to confirm that this is still very, very much your view and intention, and will be emphasised at the NATO conference this September.
Yeah. No, well, I don't resile from what I've said about the importance of our defence budget and what that should mean for the future at all. Where I'd take issue slightly with former Secretary Gates is I think actually if you look at the equipment programme for our Navy, it is absolutely a full spectrum equipment programme. You've got the 2 carriers under construction, you've got the Type 45 destroyers now coming into action, one of those modern effective warships anywhere in the world. You've got the future frigate programme, which is there. You've got the hunter-killer submarines increasingly rolling off the stocks in Barrow. You've got the Trident submarines and the pledge to renew them. And obviously the immense ability of the Royal Marines. So I mean, I think, in terms of the Navy, I think it's got a very bright future, and it is a full spectrum capability from, the nuclear deterrent at one end to, smaller vessels right at the other end. So I don't accept that we are, shrinking the Navy, or it's not a full spectrum capability. It absolutely is. As for what you said about Asia, I can completely agree. I think we've doubled. I think we've seen a big increase in our exports to China, for instance, but we're still only 1% of Chinese exports. We could quite easily get to 2%, which would be great for us, without there being a huge change.
To have a little more flexibility, Prime Minister, there are some who would suggest that having more Type 26 type frigates in order to be able to have the global reach to meet the very ambitions you've been talking about today would be more than useful.
Well, I have this debate with the Navy all the time because clearly what's been happening is that we are having fewer, more expensive ships. The Type 45s, are pretty close to £1 billion each. They are phenomenally expensive, but they are, as I said, the most modern, the most effective. One of our Type 45s is actually doing a tour of the Far East at the moment, and I think is getting quite a lot of attention. But there's obviously a discussion we should have about, is there a role for other sorts of vessels that we should be building as well, and what's the trade-off between these multi-purpose ships that can do everything from drug interdiction in the Caribbean right through to carrier escorts or complex warfare. Is it right to do that, or should you try to have more ships that are carrying out more different tasks? And I think this is a debate that will continue, but up to now the answer has been let's have the multi-role ships that can do everything.
Thank you for that. Could I switch to another subject which I feel must be very, very much the role of the NSC, and that's energy, on the energy policy. And it seems to us that there are two aspects of it. You have the shorter-term policy and you have the longer-term policy. First of all, the longer-term policy, overall, would I be right in saying that the only real energy security strategy is a DECC, the Department of Energy and Climate Change document, which obviously leaves out foreign policy, planning and a range of other issues, and frankly looking 50, 100 years ahead as to what we should be considering. Is that not something which is top of the agenda when one's thinking of our needs in the years to come on long term? And I'll come back to short term in a moment, sir.
Well, I mean, clearly energy security is vital. We were talking earlier, Lord Waldegrave, about how do you define security? Clearly your energy security, the ability to power your economy, to power your homes and businesses, is an absolutely key aspect of your security. And it is something taken seriously by the National Security Council. We have discussed it and taken papers on it. I would argue that we have a good strategy now. We are renewing our nuclear with Hinkley Point and Wilver to follow next. We've set out a very clear strategy so everyone knows what the rules and the costs are for investing in renewables. And we're moving ahead not just with new gas plants as appropriate, but also with onshore shale gas, which I think could be a major industry for Britain in the future. So I think we've got a long-term plan, and we've just got to make sure that every piece of that is put in place.
But I think our position as being an island does put us in a different position in the long term, being reliant on so much which comes in from overseas.
Well, I think if you look at our energy penetration of imports compared with other countries, because of the North Sea, we've had a relatively good record. We've got the interconnector with France. There's the potential of an interconnector with Norway. If we make the most of shale gas, then as North Sea gas runs down, we'll have a new national resource. So when I look at our position in Europe and look at how reliant we are on imports, I think we're in a relatively secure position. But we must keep that up. I mean, that's why the relationship with Qatar and others in terms of imported gas, the relationship with Norway is fantastically important. Making sure we get a decent contribution from renewables and making this nuclear program work. They all matter. We mustn't slip up on them.
Could I bring up what I think is a really serious problem? We believe our country is facing a potentially very serious crisis of supply and competitiveness at this very moment of time we speak. And are you prepared to set aside the targets in the 2008 Climate Change Act in order to get through this period? I mean, if you're unable to act unilaterally, would you urgently seek a consensus amongst the major EU economies from a moratorium on behalf of the 2020 commitments? Prime Minister, what I really was going to ask on with that is, do you accept now in retrospect that these targets, although set by the former government but were endorsed by you, were a huge mistake that threatens to severely damage and indeed are already damaging Europe's competitiveness and growth prospects in the years to come?
Well, I think there's...
Before you answer that question, Prime Minister, can I just say that it is a subject of interest and one that we've discussed, but the view that Lord Stirling has just expressed may not be shared by everybody.
Of course. Thank you. No, I think there are two questions in there. One is the Climate Change Act framework, can that work for us in the long term? And my answer to that is yes, it can. We set these carbon budgets. We have to make sure that they are achievable and deliverable, but I support the Climate Change Act, and I think we can continue to make it work. The second question is about part of it is, I think, about the European targets, which I think we are capable of meeting. I think, you know, if you go back over history and argue whether it was right to have as many specific targets, you might come to a different answer, and indeed Europe is reviewing, the EU is reviewing this at the moment, about whether the specific targets are correct. But I mean, look, the question I ask, and I got the energy industries, the national grid, Ofgem, DEC, and everybody else round the cabinet table so I can eyeball them and absolutely check that our situation is robust, is, are we content that with the rules that we have in place and everything we have in place, that we are energy secure in terms of our short, medium and long-term future, or are there any changes that we need to make about decommissioning coal plants, bringing on gas more quickly, or anything else? And the answer I got was that the rules and regulations and capacity mechanisms are in place so that we have the energy security that we need. So I'll go on asking that question, because the question you put is very important, but I don't think either the Climate Change Act or our own situation is one that we will always be concerned about, but I don't think it's one where we need to make some major change.
Just taking account of what the chairman rightly brought out, this is not just my view. There's Dr. Biron, who's the head of the International Energy Agency, based in Paris, who's in here in London today. We were discussing only this subject of deep, critical concern about European competitiveness in the coming period.
I agree with that, but I think that the European Union has, the countries of the European Union will debate this at the March Council, has got to think very carefully about international competitiveness and energy prices, and we ought to be comparing, for instance, our position with that of the United States. In the United States, they got 10,000 shale gas wells. In Europe, we've got about 100. And so I think we do need to think about the competitiveness picture. I completely agree with that. But that doesn't mean, I think, throwing out of the window the concern about carbon emission reduction. What it means is completing the energy single market in Europe. That would be a very good thing. It means making sure we make the most of shale gas. It means making sure that as well as being committed to green energy, we are committed to cheap green energy, and we keep driving down the price of these new technologies. If we do all those things, we can be green and competitive.
We're almost out of time. I just want to take you back for a moment, and then Mr. Pritchard wants to come in briefly, to something you said about the maritime effort and about the Navy. Could I remind you what CDS said recently, which is that unless we change our current course, we may have exquisite equipment, but not enough people to staff it. And he in particular said that the Royal Navy was perilously close to its critical mass. Could I just, I mean, I applauded what you said about the Navy.
Right. Well, I think, to be fair to CDS, I think what he said was that if spending reductions went further, there would be a danger of what he called hollowing out. I don't think he actually said we were in danger of that happening with what we have. The point I would make is that in the SDSR, we made decisions with the chiefs of the defence staff around the table that were about the future capabilities of the UK, and a very strong argument was made, which I completely agree with, that we need to have a navy that is full spectrum, that has got everything from those new hunter-killer submarines to the Type 45s to the future frigates and everything else. And that was a real priority. And we've taken this gap in carrier capability, which we're going to refresh with the new carriers, and that is incredibly important. And I don't see that. I think obviously we want to do everything we can on value for money, on efficiency. But I think if we do that, I don't see any reason why we won't be able to properly run and crew these excellent these excellent assets. And also, I think it's going to be, in terms of encouraging people to join the Navy, there's the opportunities when you've got this absolutely world-beating first-class equipment that is running out of our shipyards at the moment. I would have thought that's a terrific advert to encourage people to join up.
James?
Can I applaud what you've just said about the gap being replaced by new carriers? Thank you.
Mr. Pritchard, you've got about 2 minutes.
Thank you. Going back to Sir Malcolm's earlier question on Scotland, and this is a question I put to Sir Peter Ricketts prior to his departure to Paris, and in fact to Sir John saw in a public open meeting, and that is, if the separatists get their way and break Scotland off from the United Kingdom, what are the national security implications for that? I think you've stated publicly, indeed in Edinburgh, some of those implications, but I wonder whether you can elaborate a little more.
Well,
There is no time for you to develop.
Okay, I mean, in a nutshell, I profoundly believe we are more secure together, as well as more prosperous and all the rest of it. And Scotland makes an enormous contribution to the UK's defence, and I'll be making a speech about this soon, which is, it's very important that everyone in the rest of the United Kingdom emphasises how much we benefit from Scotland staying in the United Kingdom, and that's an argument I feel very passionately about.
We're very grateful, Prime Minister, and I think we've all been pretty disciplined and got through most of the things we wanted to get through. I think you will have gathered that we are very anxious. There's lots that's good in the National Security Strategy. We're anxious that the next one be even better, anxious to contribute to it. One point that we have made repeatedly is how much we would like to see it draw on outside experts and other views, without any disrespect to the excellent people that we have in Whitehall. And a couple of times it's been suggested that the government might consult this committee, and we very much hope that it will, and we will do our best to be cooperative and helpful.
Thank you. I mean, we're very keen to hear the views of others. I mean, in the end, the government has got to own this document, and so it's got to reflect our collective view, but the more input and also identifying gaps and weaknesses that your committee does, frankly, the better.
That's very kind of you. Thank you very much indeed. Order. The meeting is now adjourned.
Good. And I think we're now going to have a massive vote. Good. That's all.
The Boothroyd Room. Portcullis House, 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 the Boothroyd Room.